The grounding of a 1,300-foot container ship on March 23rd in the Suez Canal, the infamous Ever Given incident, casts a light on the role the Red Sea choke points play in supplying goods to global markets. There are three major choke points along the Red Sea: the Suez Canal, the Straits of Tiran, and the Bab el-Mandeb. In fact, the only Red Sea states that have direct access to the open seas are Yemen and Somalia in the south. The rest have contingent access to the open seas. That is, they must go through some sort of choke point. Of course, these choke points carry risks. A decade ago, that risk came from piracy off the Somali coast. Now it comes from a rebel group in Yemen that occasionally sends rockets into the Red Sea. Closing these choke points can have detrimental economic effects because companies have to reroute their shipments down along the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, a journey that's several times longer and much more expensive. On top of that, closing a global checkpoint can lead to war. Egypt's closure of the Straits of Tiran in the northern part of the Red Sea helped spark the Six-Day War in 1967. Yet, in recent years, global players have flocked to the Red Sea because there's this exciting economic story developing on the African coast. These states have large populations and high GDP growth, so with a little infrastructure development, roads, ports, these could be massive consumer markets of the future. China knows this and has already cast many of the Red Sea states in a starring role in its Belt and Road Initiative. These graphics collectively paint a picture of the 9 Red Sea coastal states during the pre-COVID period. The first shows the amount of shoreline that each state claims along the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Shoreline matters because it gives a country access to territorial waters and whatever's under them. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen dominate, while the coastline of Israel and Jordan are exceptionally short, only a couple of miles long. By population, which is an important indicator of the size of these potential consumer markets, Egypt, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen dwarf their neighbors. Ethiopia joins this club as well, although it doesn't sit on the Red Sea, and requires access to a neighbor's port, but it has a massive population as well. If we move to total annual trade value, Saudi Arabia clearly leads, although Israel's in the mix. Note that some of the states with the smallest trade value have the highest GDP growth. Djibouti and Eritrea, but also Egypt, are growing their economies at some of the world's highest rates. It'll take years for them to catch up to the trade value of a country like Saudi Arabia, of course, but the asymmetry seen in these graphics might narrow somewhat with time. Of course, the coronavirus pandemic might tame all of this potential for a bit, but the African coast is expected to see continued economic growth in the next few decades, which is why so many countries are coming there. And migration is also an issue. In fact, the Red Sea is one of the very rare places in the world where refugees are fleeing one way across the water, while migrants are going the other way in hopes of making their way up to the Gulf states to find a job. These security risks and the centrality of the Red Sea has drawn many countries to establish a military presence there. So we have a major military presence, tons of security risks, and a layer of political fragility over it all, but also this incredible economic potential that's really bringing countries to the table. Any successful U.S. approach to this complex set of challenges must begin by recognizing the Red Sea as a distinct emerging region. What happens in the Red Sea has implications for the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and Asia. At present, the U.S. bureaucracy treats the area as multiple regions. There is Africa policy on the west, Middle East policy to the east, and Europe policy to the north. U.S. government officials call this the seam. And in this particular case, it runs down the Red Sea and both the State Department and the Pentagon. As the Gulf begins to interact more with East Africa and vice versa, and as Turkey, China, Russia, and others increasingly become involved in the Red Sea, these seams are going to become more problematic. The U.S. bureaucracy cannot radically shift overnight, but there are a few ways to overcome these challenges. One is to have a serious conversation internally about whether to adjust the seam. The second is to develop good interagency cooperation to deal with these interconnected countries. Third, we could work with our allies. For example, the U.S. could host a Red Sea summit, perhaps jointly with Europe. Most importantly, it's increasingly clear this is a region of its own. Certainly that's how the rest of the world sees it, and the United States needs to as well, and develop a holistic policy towards it.